on to commonlit.org, and you will see an assignment there with a reading that's called The Story of Prometheus and Pandora's Box. And so yesterday, when we were going over the notes for the introduction to Greek mythology, on that initial screen where I said, why do we even study mythology? And there were a bunch of pictures, and one of them was a picture of the icon that the music company Pandora uses. And so I thought it would be fitting to kind of read, especially for those of you who don't know about Pandora's box, it would be fitting to read just a short little story about where that comes from. So this story is obviously from Greek mythology. So if we read the background section here, it says James Baldwin was an educator and prolific children's book author who rewrote many classic legends and myths for young readers. In almost every culture, there are myths and folk tales that explain how the world got to be the way it is and that ask important questions about the human condition. Greek mythology in particular has been read widely in the West and retold in sophisticated high poetry. In this version, however, James Baldwin adopts a more accessible tone, turning revered Greek mythology into old Greek stories. So as you read, take notes or pay attention to the way Baldwin reveals the themes of these myths, and pay attention to his tone in how he feels about this. Remember, tone is the writer's attitude toward the subject. Sometimes it's objective and they're just telling the story. See if that's the way it is with Baldwin, or if he's taking on a specific tone as he tells this story. How fire was given to men. In those old times, there lived two brothers who were not like other men, nor yet like those mighty ones who lived upon the mountaintop. So that's referencing Mount Olympus, where the Olympians, the gods and goddesses, resided. They were the sons of one of those titans, we mentioned them yesterday, who had fought against Jupiter and had been sent in chains to the strong prison house of the lower world. The name of the elder of these brothers was Prometheus, or Forethought, for he was always thinking of the future and making things ready for what might happen tomorrow, or next week, or next year, or it may be in 100 years to come. The younger was called Epimetheus, or Afterthought, for he was always so busy thinking of yesterday, or last year, or 100 years ago, that he had no care at all for what might come to pass after a while. For some cause, Jupiter had not sent these brothers to prison with the rest of the Titans. So who's Jupiter? That's the Roman name that the Romans took when, remember I said yesterday how the Romans took all the Greek myths and they basically stole their stories and then just changed the character names into Roman names. So Jupiter is the Roman name equivalent to the Greek god Zeus. So Jupiter is Zeus. Prometheus did not care to live amid the clouds on the mountaintop. He was too busy for that. While the mighty folk, the Olympians, were spending their time in idleness, drinking nectar and eating ambrosia, he was intent upon plans for making the world wiser and better than it had ever been before. Remember, Prometheus is the one that always thinks of the future. He's always preparing for what's to come. So Prometheus went out amongst men to live with them and to help them, for his heart was filled with sadness when he found out that they were no longer happy as they had been during the golden days when Saturn was king. Oh, how very poor and wretched they were. He found them living in caves and in holes of the earth, shivering with the cold because there was no fire, dying of starvation, hunted by wild beasts and by one another, the most miserable of all living creatures. If only they had fire, said Prometheus to himself. They could at least warm themselves and cook their food, and after a while they could learn to make tools and build themselves houses. Without fire, they are worse off than beasts. Then he went boldly to Jupiter, Zeus, and begged him to give fire to men. that so they might have a little comfort through the long, dreary months of winter. Not a spark will I give, said Jupiter. No, indeed. Why, if men had fire, they might become strong and wise like ourselves, and after a while they'd drive us out of our own kingdom. Let them shiver with cold, and let them live like beasts. It's best for them to be poor and ignorant, so that we mighty ones may thrive and be happy. Prometheus made no answer, but he had set his heart on helping mankind, and he did not give up. He turned away and left Jupiter and his mighty company forever. As he was walking by the shore of the sea, he found a reed, or as some say, a tall stalk of fennel, growing, and when he had broken it off, he saw that its hollow center was filled with a dry, soft pith, which would burn slowly and keep on fire a long time. He took the long stalk in his hands and started with it towards the dwelling of the sun in the far east. Mankind shall have fire in spite of the tyrant who sits on the mountaintop, he said. He reached the place of the sun in the early morning, just as the glowing golden orb was rising from the earth and beginning his daily journey through the sky. Notice how even the sun is personified into being a person. He touched the end of the long reed to the flames, and the dry pith caught on fire and burned slowly. Then he turned and hastened back to his own land, carrying with him the precious spark hidden in the hollow center of the plant. He called some of the shivering men from their caves and built a fire for them and showed them how to warm themselves by it and how to build other fires from the coals. Soon there was a cheerful blaze in every rude home in the land, and men and women gathered round it and were warm and happy and thankful to Prometheus for the wonderful gift which he had brought them from the sun. It was not long until they learned to cook their food and so to eat like men instead of beasts. They began at once to leave off their wild and savage habits, and instead of lurking in the dark places of the world, they came out into the open air and the bright sunlight and were glad because life had been given to them. After that, Prometheus taught them, little by little, 1,000 things. He showed them how to build houses of wood and stone, how to tame sheep and cattle and make them useful, how to plow and sow and reap, and how to protect themselves from the storms of winter and the beasts of the woods. Then he showed them how to dig in the earth for copper and iron, and how to melt the ore, and how to hammer it into shape and fashion from it the tools and weapons which they needed in peace and war. And when he saw how happy the world was becoming, he cried out, "A new golden age shall come, brighter and better by far than the old." Things might have gone on very happily indeed, and the golden age might really have come again had it not been for Jupiter, Zeus. But one day when he chanced to look down upon the earth, he saw the fires burning, he being Zeus and Jupiter, and the people living in the houses, and the flocks feeding on the hills, and the grain ripening in the fields, and this made Zeus very angry. "Who has done all this?" he asked, and someone answered, "Prometheus." "What? That young Titan?" he cried. "I will punish him in a way that will make him wish I had shut him up in the prison house with his kinsfolk. But as for the puny men, let them keep their fire. I will make them 10 times more miserable than they were before they had it." Of course, it would be easy enough to deal with Prometheus at any time, and so Jupiter was in no great haste about it. He made up his mind to distress mankind first, and he thought of a plan for doing it in a very strange, roundabout way. In the first place, he ordered his blacksmith, Vulcan, whose forge was in the crater of a burning mountain, to take a lump of clay, which he gave him, and mold it into the form of a woman. Vulcan did as he was bidden, and when he had finished the image, he carried it up to Jupiter, who was sitting among the clouds with all the mighty folk around him. It was nothing but a mere lifeless body, but the great blacksmith had given it a form more perfect than that of any statue that has ever been made. "Come now," said Jupiter, "let us all give some goodly gift to this woman." And he began by giving her life. Then the others came in their turn, each with a gift for the marvelous creature. One gave her beauty, another a pleasant voice, another good manners, another a kind heart, and another skill in many arts, and lastly, someone gave her curiosity. Then they called her Pandora, which means the all gifted, because she had received gifts from them all. Pandora was so beautiful and so wondrously gifted that no one could help loving her. When the mighty folk had admired her for a time, they gave her to Mercury, the light footed, and he led her down the mountainside to the place where Prometheus and his brother were living and toiling for the good of mankind. He met Epimetheus first and said to him, Epimetheus, here's a beautiful woman whom Jupiter has sent to you to be your wife. Prometheus had often warned his brother to beware of any gift that Jupiter or Zeus might send, for he knew that the mighty tyrant could not be trusted. But when Epimetheus saw Pandora, how lovely and wise she was, he forgot all the warnings and he took her home to live with him and be his wife. Pandora was very happy in her new home, and even Prometheus, when he saw her, was pleased with her loveliness. She had brought with her a golden casket which Jupiter had given her at parting, and which he had told her held many precious things. But wise Athena, the queen of the air, had warned her never, never to open it, nor to look at the things inside. They must be jewels, she said to herself, and then she thought of how they would add to her beauty if only she could wear them. Well, why did Jupiter give them to me if I should never use them, nor so much as look at them? She asked. And the more she thought about the golden casket, the more curious she was to see what was in it. And every day she took it down from its shelf and she felt of the lid and tried to peer inside of it without opening it. Why should I care for what Athena told me? She said at last. She's not beautiful, and jewels would be of no use to her. I think that I'll just look at them at any rate. Athena will never know. Nobody else will ever know. So she opened the lid just a little, just to peep inside. All at once there was a whirring, rustling sound, and before she could shut it down again, out flew 10,000 strange creatures with death-like faces and gaunt and dreadful forms such as nobody in the world had ever seen. They fluttered for a little while about the room, and then they flew away to find dwelling places wherever there were homes of men. They were diseases and cares, for up to that time mankind had not had any kind of sickness, nor felt any troubles of mind, nor worried about what the morrow might bring forth. These creatures flew into every house, and without anyone seeing them, they nestled down into the bosoms of men and women and children and put an end to all their joy. And ever since that day, they have been flitting and creeping, unseen and unheard, over all the land, bringing pain and sorrow and death into every household. If Pandora had not shut down the lid so quick, things would have gotten much worse. But she closed it just in time to keep the last of the evil creatures from getting out. The name of this creature was Foreboding, and although he was almost half out of the casket, Pandora pushed him back and shut the lid so tight that he could never escape. If he had gotten out into the world, men would have known from childhood just what troubles were going to come to them every day of their lives, and they would never have had any joy or hope so long as they lived. And this was the way in which Jupiter, Zeus, sought to make mankind more miserable than they had been before Prometheus had befriended them. Okay, so that's the story. You've been introduced to Prometheus, to Epimetheus, his brother, and what Prometheus did to upset Zeus, the high god, and then what Zeus's revenge on mankind was because of what Prometheus did. So let's look at the assessment questions. There are 3 multiple choice, which period one will answer, and periods 5, 6, and 9, what you guys will answer, those of you who are at home. And then there's also a question 4, which is a short answer, which the honors kids will answer. Okay. So let's look at the multiple choice. Which of the following best identifies a central theme of this novel? Or excuse me, this myth. Now, when we think theme, I've taught you guys to think of it as a full sentence, a lesson. So really, I wouldn't call these themes. I would call these just subjects. So which of these, A, B, C, or D, which of these is a subject around which a theme could be developed from this myth? Is it abuse of power, the necessity or the need for curiosity? Is it violence and war, or beauty and art? So you need to kind of look at what is most, I guess, what's happening most often. Is there a lot of abuse of power in this story? Does that seem to be a central idea? How about the need for curiosity? Was there a need for curiosity? Who was curious? Was that prevalent from the beginning of the story to the end, or just kind of in one section? Violence and war. Is there some violence here? Kind of in a backhanded way. Is there war? No, there's not anybody fighting with one another. They're being sly and backstabbing one another, but I wouldn't call that war. And then beauty and art. Is there beauty in this story? Well, Pandora was described as being beautiful, but is that what this entire story revolves around? Okay, so I think C and D, remember I'm always talking about how you need to remove 2 of the options. I would definitely say C and D are the ones that you remove, and you're left with A and B. So which one of those plays a more dominant role in this story? Moving on to number 2. Be careful with this one because it is asking for 2 answers. So you're going to look at the question, which says, which 2 phrases from the text best support the answer to part A? And there are 6 options there. So you're going to be choosing 2 of those. And it's, of course, going to depend on what you chose for question number 1. All right. And then match them up. Typically, remember, when they structure these questions, there are ones that kind of match up with each of the options from the previous question. So if you know C and D were not it, which of these went with C and D? Take those out of the mix to begin with. So you remember to use your questioning and your, I guess, the answering of your questions. Use the strategies that we've talked about. All right, let's move on to the last question. Question 3. How does the way Prometheus describes Jupiter differ from the way the narrator describes Jupiter? So that one's definitely, you have to look back at the wording. What does Prometheus, the character, think of him versus the way that the narrator seems to? So you're going to have to look back in the text and figure that out. Prometheus thinks Jupiter is disloyal. Did he say that? Well, I seem to remember there at the end when he talks to his brother, and said that he should never trust a gift from the gods because Zeus couldn't be trusted. So maybe. Does the narrator see him as just? Does he feel like Zeus or Jupiter is justified in his behavior and his retribution? B, Prometheus does not understand Jupiter, while the narrator knows Jupiter is evil. C, Prometheus reveres the king of the gods. So does Prometheus respect the gods or not? What does he say about all the gods who sit up in the mountains, or excuse me, in the clouds on Mount Olympus? And then finally, D, Prometheus sees Jupiter as an unjust tyrant, while the narrator calls him a mighty one without judgment. So you're going to have to really kind of look back and separate Prometheus's thoughts from the narrator's thoughts. All right. So this kind of the first, I think, paragraph is definitely your narrator speaking. And then you really have to look and see whose thoughts belong to who. So if you look at this dialogue, the things that Prometheus said, those are certainly his thoughts. Whereas when you look at the narration part, those are probably going to be more of the narrator's thoughts. All right, so separate them out. Honors kids, you're going to go on and do number 4, which says, how does the language and word choice in paragraph 2 contribute to the tone of the myth. So looking just at paragraph 2, which is this, the name of the elder of these brothers was Prometheus, or forethought, for he was always thinking of the future and making things ready for what might happen tomorrow or next week or next year, or it may be in 100 years to come. The younger was called Epimetheus, or afterthought, for he was always so busy thinking of yesterday or last year or 100 years ago that he had no care at all for what might come to pass after a while. So how do the words used there contribute to the narrator's tone, or the author's tone, not the narrator, sorry, the author's tone overall? All right, if you have questions, email me. Otherwise, those are due at the end of the day today.